So as we saw in our discussion for the origins of the wargaming in the previous video, we saw that the 17th century was the first time in history where a modern representation of the wargame would be the Georg Venturini variation, which replaced the actual boards for detailed terrain representations. And this was predominantly called the war chess. Georg Venturini was a teacher of war strategies, and he devised intricate calculations for movement and added a representation on the table of the actual map, even though it was not a cartography masterpiece, but at least it was said that was the representation of the border between France and Belgium, which is pretty interesting to note. He added logistic pieces which were not added before, meaning that he would calculate important and interesting things about warfare that were the camp followers and the logistic problems that were basically an illness of the time. Further in time, we see the appearance of von Reiswitz, which he will be the father of the wargames proper, meaning that von Reiswitz would add upon Venturini's work a sand terrain. He would use sand terrain instead of a map. The reason that he's using sand terrain at this point is because sand terrain is going to be um, something that could be modified. But further, he would appear with a huge apparatus, mostly because he was invited to show his new game and to represent his game for the King of Prussia himself. So he would come with a huge apparatus, a huge table with a map, and he would also include detachable squares for the map. He would add a book of instructions, and he also would calculate movement. The movement is going to be calculated more accurately with rulers. How the people received this um, was not as expected, especially because the 19th century is not so plagued with huge wars, so to speak. So the actual hype would be reduced further in time. However, von Reiswitz had a son that was actually in the military. He was a member of the Prussian army. We're talking about Rudolf Reiswitz's son. And he developed his father's work further in the 19th century, more specifically in 1824. Is going to create the Kriegspiel as we know it. He would add real military maps, which was something that was never done before. He would add also calculations for combat. The combat results was something that was discussed before and not calculated in mathematical terms. In addition, he will add to the instructions dice rolls, so this would create a little bit of uncertainty, in which is something very usual in warfare. And also we have more sophisticated rules for types of terrain, marshes, snow, and mountains. So he would be very clear in the fact that soldiers would move in difficult terrain, and there would be penalties for the use of those squares. Exactly. We are traversing the 19th century, and by the when the 20th century is at the horizon, by 1912, there is going to be the appearance of H.G. Wells. So H.G. Wells wrote the book Little Wars. Little Wars is basically the attestment of how the war games would start to evolve and would start to get a little bit of these tints of a recreational or entertainment. So Little Wars was to simplify the previous instructions for Kriegspiel. So he wanted to make the game something more approachable for different audiences, not only military audiences. Military units were basically porcelain. He would make metal toy soldiers and was played on an open space, like a playground for adults, in which there were a setting, small houses, roads, and stuff that would be used as cover for the actual small soldiers. So in this case, combat was resolved by physically shooting the toy soldiers, and this was a very novel thing to think about. If you analyze the fact that before Wells, everything was so mathematical and it appealed more to military men. So people that never before had anything to do with the army wouldn't be so much interested in that type of game. But by making the game more dynamic, more physical, by throwing stuff at, at the actual small soldiers, that was something different. And the rules were really, really simplified. You can see the rules in his book. At this point there is going to be the two the two wars are going to start, the Great War and World War II. This is going to make a some sort of a gap in between Wells' Little Wars to what is going to be next in the evolution of the war games. A note here: by the time of the Great War, the war games became a way to solve logistics questions and planning mobilization schedules. And after these, when during World War II was happening, Wargame was much more of a means to analyze systems, in which was called the Operations Research, or OR. At this time, the game was less about the study of history, the study of past military operations, which was the basis of the earlier war games, and was not to be taken back up to the 1970s and through the 80s with the advent of Charles S. Roberts and his wargame tactics.